The silver-embossed invitation trembled in Vivienne Montgomery's hands as late afternoon sunlight streamed through her office window, illuminating words that felt like tiny daggers to her heart. You are cordially invited to celebrate the engagement of Maxwell Harrington. Her stomach clenched, a physical reaction she couldn't control. The elegant cardstock suddenly felt too heavy in her fingers, the beautiful calligraphy blurring as she blinked back unexpected tears. Have you ever had that moment when you realized you'd fallen for someone completely unavailable? When the very thing you've been denying to yourself becomes painfully clear at the worst possible moment. For Vivienne Montgomery, that moment came in the form of an invitation to plan the engagement party of the man who had unknowingly captured her heart. Every detail of that celebration, from the rare blue orchids she'd sourced from Thailand to the vintage champagne he'd insisted on, had been meticulously arranged by her own hands. For weeks, she'd worked closely with Maxwell Harrington, selecting the perfect venue overlooking Lake Michigan, designing an atmosphere that reflected his understated elegance. Not once had he mentioned a fiancée. But what Vivienne couldn't possibly know was that Maxwell Harrington had a plan of his own, one that would turn her carefully controlled world upside down and force her to decide. Was protecting her heart worth sacrificing the chance at real happiness? Vivienne set the invitation down on her desk, her manicured fingernails tapping against the polished mahogany as she tried to steady her breathing. At 35, she'd built Monarch Events into one of Chicago's premier event planning companies through sheer determination and an almost pathological attention to detail. She prided herself on her professionalism, on never mixing business with pleasure. But something about Maxwell Harrington had gotten under her skin from the moment he'd walked into her office 6 months ago. His quiet intensity, the way his eyes crinkled when he actually smiled, how he remembered her coffee order and asked about her sister's wedding plans. Little things that shouldn't have mattered but somehow did. Viv, the Donovan wedding coordinator, is on line 2. Her assistant's voice crackled through the intercom, pulling her back to reality. Thanks, Tessa. I'll take it. Vivienne straightened her shoulders and picked up the phone, pushing thoughts of Maxwell Harrington and his mystery fiancé aside. She had a business to run, a reputation to maintain. Whatever foolish attraction she'd been harboring needed to end right now. But as she discussed flower arrangements and seating charts with the Donovan coordinator, her eyes kept drifting back to the invitation. In 3 days, she would have to stand in that beautiful lakeside venue she created, smile professionally, and congratulate Maxwell Harrington on his engagement to a woman she'd never even heard him mention. The thought made her feel slightly ill. If you've ever had your heart broken by unexpected news, hit that like button and let me know in the comments. Sometimes the hardest moments come when we least expect them. 6 months earlier, Vivienne had been reviewing quarterly projections when Tessa buzzed her intercom. Ms. Montgomery? There's a Maxwell Harrington here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment, but he says it's important. Vivienne frowned. The name was familiar. The billionaire real estate developer whose Harrington Towers had transformed Chicago's skyline. Give me 2 minutes, then send him in. She quickly tidied her desk and smoothed her hair, professional instincts kicking in. When her office door opened, she wasn't prepared for the man who entered. Maxwell Harrington was tall, with broad shoulders and a presence that seemed to fill the room without effort. But it was his eyes that caught her attention. Gray and intensely focused, taking in every detail of her office before settling on her. Not the calculating gaze of most wealthy clients, but something more curious. Ms. Montgomery. His voice was deep, with a warmth that surprised her. Thank you for seeing me without an appointment. I know how valuable your time is. Vivienne rose, extending her hand. Mr. Harrington, what can Monarch Events do for you today? His handshake was firm, his palm warm against hers. I need someone to handle my company's annual charity gala. Our usual planner had a family emergency, and we're 6 weeks out with nothing finalized. 6 weeks. Vivienne couldn't hide her surprise. Events of that caliber typically required months of preparation. That's an extremely tight timeline for a major gala. I'm aware. A slight smile curved his lips. That's why I'm here. I was told you're the best in Chicago, the only person who might be able to pull off a miracle. Flattery from clients wasn't unusual, but something in his direct gaze made her believe he meant it. Tell me about your vision for the event. For the next hour, they discussed the gala, a fundraiser for the Harrington Foundation's education initiatives. What struck Vivienne wasn't just his clear ideas about what he wanted, but his willingness to listen to her suggestions. Unlike most wealthy clients who treated her as merely a vendor to execute their demands, Maxwell Harrington engaged with her as a partner. So, he said finally, can you do it? Can you create something extraordinary in 6 weeks? Vivienne should have said no. Her schedule was already packed, and a rush job for a client of his stature was risky. But something, professional pride, perhaps, or the challenge in his eyes, made her nod. We can do it, Mr. Harrington, but I'll need complete access to your team and quick decisions on my recommendations. Max, he said, if we're going to pull this off together, you should call me Max. Vivienne, she replied, surprising herself with the informality. As he left her office, Vivienne had the unsettling feeling that something significant had just happened, though she couldn't have said exactly what. The charity gala was a triumph. Under the soaring ceilings of the Chicago Cultural Center, Vivienne had transformed the space into an enchanted garden, with living walls of greenery, delicate lighting that mimicked fireflies, and tables adorned with sustainable centerpieces that would later be planted in community gardens across the city. You've exceeded every expectation, Max told her, finding her checking on the dessert service near the end of the evening. Everyone is talking about how this is the most memorable foundation event we've ever had. Vivienne felt a flush of pride. I'm glad it met your standards. Met them? You redefined them. His gray eyes held hers for a moment longer than necessary. I'd like to hire Monarch for all Harrington corporate events going forward. If you're interested. She was interested, professionally, of course. The Harrington account would be lucrative and prestigious. That's what she told herself as she agreed to his proposal, ignoring the flutter in her stomach when he smiled. What she didn't know then was how those next months would unfold. The weekly meetings that ran longer than scheduled, the coffee he brought her, oat milk latte with cinnamon, exactly how she liked it, the way he actually listened when she spoke. Small moments that built something she hadn't felt in years. You're overthinking this. Audrey's voice was firm through the phone speaker as Vivienne stood in her closet 3 days after receiving the invitation, surveying potential outfits for the engagement party. It's just another client event. I know that, Vivienne replied, pulling out a midnight blue dress she hadn't worn in years. I'm just surprised he never mentioned he was in a relationship, let alone planning to get engaged. We spent hours discussing his preferences for this party. Maybe it was a whirlwind romance, her older sister suggested. Or maybe billionaires just don't share their personal lives with their event planners. Vivienne winced at the gentle reality check. You're right. I'm being ridiculous. You're not ridiculous, Audrey's voice softened. You're human. And from everything you've told me about this guy, he sounds pretty great. It's natural you'd feel something. Well, whatever I'm feeling needs to stop, Vivienne said firmly, hanging the blue dress back up and pulling out a sleek black number instead. Maxwell Harrington is a client. Nothing more. After saying goodbye to Audrey, Vivienne sat on the edge of her bed, the black dress draped beside her. The truth was, she hadn't felt this kind of attraction, this connection, to anyone since Daniel had walked out 3 years ago, leaving her with a mountain of debt hidden beneath his charming exterior. Daniel Reed had been everything she thought she wanted. Handsome, charismatic, ambitious. Their whirlwind romance had swept her off her feet, culminating in moving in together after just 6 months. It wasn't until he disappeared one day, leaving nothing but a note and a stack of unpaid bills, that she discovered the truth. The investment firm he claimed to work for didn't exist, and the money he'd invested for their future was gone. She'd rebuilt everything from scratch. Her life, her business, her confidence. She transformed from Daniel Reed's girlfriend into Vivienne Montgomery, owner of Monarch Events, the woman Chicago's elite called when they needed perfection. She'd paid off Daniel's debts and created a life that was entirely her own. And she'd done it all without letting another man close enough to hurt her. Until Maxwell Harrington had walked into her office 6 months ago. Something about his quiet confidence, so different from Daniel's flashy charm, had resonated with her. Over the months of working together, that resonance had deepened into what? Attraction? Friendship? Whatever it was, it had been entirely one-sided, apparently. Vivienne stood, smoothing the wrinkles from her slacks. This was exactly why she didn't mix business with pleasure. This was why she kept her relationships professional and her heart guarded. She had a job to do on Saturday night. And Vivienne Montgomery always did her job flawlessly, no matter what. The weeks leading up to the engagement party had been a special kind of torture. Max had been more involved in the planning than for any previous event, requesting meetings to discuss every detail from the lighting design to the specific vintage of champagne. The blue orchids, he'd said during one of their planning sessions, pointing to a photo in her portfolio. Can we get those? Dendrobium blue violetta? They're extremely rare. We'd need to source them from Thailand, and the cost is not an issue, he'd finished for her. They're perfect. She'd studied him curiously. They're an unusual choice for an engagement party. Most clients prefer traditional roses or lilies. Something flickered in his eyes. Amusement? I'm not most clients, Vivienne. And this isn't most engagement parties. That had been 3 weeks ago. The same meeting where he'd shown her a selection of jewelry pieces, claiming they were potential corporate gifts for key partners. Which would you choose? He'd asked, watching her intently as she examined the options. Her fingers had lingered on a stunning sapphire ring surrounded by diamonds. This one, she'd said without hesitation. The color is extraordinary. Reminds me of those blue orchids, actually. Interesting choice, he'd murmured, closing the velvet case with a snap. Thank you for your input. Now, as she slipped into the black dress for the party, Vivienne remembered that moment, wondering if the jewelry had been for his fiancée. The thought sent another pang through her chest. Stop it, she told her reflection firmly. He's a client. Just a client. But as she fastened her mother's pearl earrings and applied a final touch of lipstick, she couldn't quite convince the woman staring back at her in the mirror. The lakeside pavilion glowed like a jewel against the darkening sky as Vivienne arrived 2 hours before guests were due. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over cream-colored roses and those stunning blue orchids, while floor-to-ceiling windows showcased Lake Michigan stretching to the horizon. Despite the ache in her chest, she couldn't help but feel a flicker of pride. The space was breathtaking, perhaps her finest work yet. She moved through the venue with practiced efficiency, checking table settings, conferring with the catering staff, adjusting floral arrangements that were already perfect. Work was her sanctuary, the one place where she always felt in control. Everything looks perfect, Vivienne. Maxwell's deep voice behind her sent an unwelcome shiver down her spine. She turned, professional smile firmly in place. Max, congratulations on your engagement. He looked devastating in a charcoal suit that emphasized his broad shoulders and the intensity in his eyes. At 38, Maxwell Harrington carried himself with the quiet assurance of a man who knew exactly who he was. Thank you. Something flickered in his gray eyes. Amusement? Nervousness? I appreciate all you've done to make tonight special. Just doing my job, she replied, checking her clipboard. The champagne will be served at 8, after your announcement. The string quartet is set up in the east corner. And I've arranged for the lighting to dim slightly when you make your toast. Max nodded, studying her face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. You've thought of everything. That's what you pay me for. She glanced around the room, avoiding his gaze. Will your fiancée be arriving soon? I'd love to introduce myself. A strange smile curved his lips. She'll be here. Before Vivienne could respond, her assistant approached with a question about the catering, and Max excused himself. For the next hour, Vivienne threw herself into last-minute details, directing staff and making tiny adjustments that no one but she would notice. Have you ever put your heart and soul into something that was breaking your heart? Share your story below. Sometimes our greatest creations come from our deepest pain. 3 months into working with Maxwell Harrington, Vivienne had begun to notice the little things. How he always arrived 5 minutes early for their meetings. How he remembered details about her life she'd only mentioned in passing. How his eyes followed her when he thought she wasn't looking. The venue for the summer benefit, he'd said during one of their planning sessions. I'd like something unexpected. Not the usual hotel ballroom. I might have just the place, Vivienne had replied, pulling out her tablet to show him photos of a restored boathouse on the lake. It's intimate, with character, and the sunset views are spectacular. As she'd swiped through the images, Max had moved closer, his shoulder brushing against hers. The contact, brief and surely accidental, had sent warmth spreading through her. It's perfect, he'd said, his voice lower than usual. When she'd looked up, his face had been inches from hers, those gray eyes studying her with an intensity that made her breath catch. For a moment, just a moment, she'd thought he might kiss her. Instead, he'd straightened, clearing his throat. The boathouse it is. I trust your judgment completely. Later that night, Audrey had listened patiently as Vivienne recounted the interaction over wine in her sister's cozy Lincoln Park apartment. You like him, Audrey had said. Not a question but a statement. He's a client, Vivienne had replied automatically. That's not what I asked. Audrey had topped off their glasses. Viv, it's been 3 years since Daniel. Maybe it's time to let someone in. The last time I let someone in, I ended up with $50,000 in debt and a broken heart. Max Harrington isn't Daniel Reed. No, Vivienne had agreed, staring into her wine. He's a billionaire with his pick of any woman in Chicago. Why would he be interested in his event planner? Audrey had given her a look that was equal parts exasperation and sympathy. Because you're brilliant, beautiful, and the only person who probably doesn't fawn all over him. But more importantly, because when you talk about him, you smile in a way I haven't seen in years. Vivienne had changed the subject then, unwilling to acknowledge the truth in her sister's words. But that night, alone in her apartment, she'd allowed herself to imagine, just for a moment, what it might be like to be with someone like Max. Someone solid, thoughtful, present in a way Daniel never was. The fantasy had been sweet, but dangerous. The next morning, she'd reinforced her professional boundaries, determined not to let her growing feelings interfere with her work. Maxwell Harrington was a client, nothing more. And now it seemed he was someone else's fiancé. By 8 o'clock, the pavilion was filled with Chicago's elite, business leaders, philanthropists, and socialites mingling beneath the crystal chandeliers. Vivienne stood near the back, surveying the scene with professional pride. Whatever her personal feelings, she had created something beautiful here. Her eyes scanned the crowd, searching for any woman who might be the future Mrs. Harrington. Would she be young and beautiful? Probably. Men like Maxwell Harrington always chose youth and beauty. The thought sent another pang through her chest, sharper than she wanted to admit. Ladies and gentlemen. Maxwell's voice carried across the room as he stepped onto the small platform near the windows. The crowd quieted, turning toward him expectantly. Thank you all for coming tonight to celebrate with me. Vivienne took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. In moments, she would see the woman who had captured Max's heart, would have to smile and congratulate them both, would have to pretend that her own heart wasn't cracking just a little. Some of you have known me for years, Max continued, and know that I've always been rather private about my personal life. A knowing chuckle rippled through the crowd. The truth is, I've spent most of my life focused on building my company, on creating something meaningful. But recently, I realized something was missing. Vivienne felt a pang in her chest. She'd had similar thoughts lately, wondering if her single-minded focus on her career had left her missing something essential. I found myself looking forward to meetings I used to dread, Max said, his eyes scanning the room. Finding excuses to discuss details I would normally delegate. All because of one person who came into my life and changed how I see everything. The crowd murmured appreciatively. Vivienne checked her watch, wondering when he would introduce his fiancée, and whether she should prepare to slip out early once her professional duties were complete. This person challenged me, surprised me, and made me laugh when I'd forgotten how. Max's voice softened. She showed me that perfection isn't about control, but about creating moments of beauty and connection. Something about his words made Vivienne pause, a strange suspicion forming in her mind. But no, that was impossible. So tonight, Max continued, I wanted to gather the people who matter most to me as I take this next step. His eyes found Vivienne's across the room, holding her gaze with an intensity that made her heart stutter. Vivienne Montgomery, would you please join me up here? The room fell silent. Vivienne stood frozen, certain she had misheard. Vivienne? Max's voice was gentle, his hand extended toward her. On legs that felt disconnected from her body, Vivienne moved through the crowd, aware of curious eyes following her progress. When she reached the platform, Max took her hand, his touch warm and steady. I'm confused, she whispered, her professional composure slipping. What's happening? Instead of answering, Max turned back to the crowd. For those who haven't had the pleasure of meeting her, this is Vivienne Montgomery, the extraordinary woman who planned this entire evening. Polite applause filled the room. Vivienne's cheeks burned. What Vivienne doesn't know, Max continued, his voice carrying clearly through the pavilion, is that she wasn't just planning an engagement party. She was planning our engagement party. The world seemed to tilt beneath Vivienne's feet. Max, what are you talking about? We're not. He turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. Vivienne, over these past 6 months, I've fallen in love with your brilliant mind, your incredible strength, and your beautiful heart. Every meeting, every phone call, every detail we discussed, they were all opportunities for me to know you better. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Vivienne felt lightheaded, caught between disbelief and a dangerous flicker of hope. I know this is unorthodox, Max said, his voice lower now, meant just for her. And I know you have every reason to be cautious. But I couldn't imagine doing this any other way. Doing what? Vivienne managed, her voice barely audible. Max reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. The crowd gasped collectively as he opened it, revealing a stunning sapphire ring surrounded by diamonds, the very one she had chosen weeks ago. You chose this, you know, he said softly. 3 weeks ago, when I asked your opinion on corporate gifts and showed you several jewelry options. Vivienne remembered the meeting, how she'd been drawn to the sapphire's deep blue, so similar to the orchids she'd selected for tonight. But I don't understand. We've never even. I know. Max's eyes held hers, vulnerable and certain all at once. I'm not asking you to marry me tonight, Vivienne. That would be presumptuous, even for me. Relief and something like disappointment flooded through her. What I'm asking, he continued, is for the chance to love you properly, to take you to dinner, to learn everything about you, to show you who I really am beyond business meetings and event planning. The pavilion was utterly silent now, 200 people holding their breath. The ring is a promise, Max said. A promise that if we reach that point, it's yours. But tonight, I'm simply asking for a beginning. Vivienne stared at him. This man who had orchestrated an entire engagement party just to ask her on a date. It was outrageous, presumptuous, completely over the top. And yet, you could have just asked me to dinner, she said finally, a smile tugging at her lips despite herself. Like a normal person. Max laughed, the sound rich and genuine. When have I ever done anything the normal way? Besides, would you have said yes? Vivienne thought about the walls she'd built after Daniel, the careful distance she maintained with all men, especially clients. Probably not, she admitted. That's what I thought. His eyes crinkled at the corners. So, will you give us, a chance, Vivienne Montgomery? The question hung between them, weighted with possibility. Vivienne was acutely aware of the crowd watching, of the absurdity of the situation, of the fear that still lingered from past wounds. But she was also aware of something else. The steady warmth of Max's hands holding hers, the sincerity in his eyes, and the realization that perhaps she wasn't too guarded for a new beginning. Yes, she said finally, her voice stronger than she expected. But you should know I don't make things easy. Max's smile was radiant. I'm counting on it. The crowd erupted in applause and cheers as Max closed the ring box and slipped it back into his pocket. For safekeeping, he told her. Until we're ready. If you believe in second chances at love, subscribe to Timeless Love Tales with Mr. Harrison for more stories that remind us it's never too late to open our hearts again. As champagne flowed and the string quartet began to play, Vivienne found herself swept into a world that felt both familiar. She had created it, after all, and entirely new. Max kept her hand in his as they moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations for a relationship that hadn't even properly begun. "I can't believe you did this," she murmured during a brief moment alone. "You realize everyone thinks we're engaged now? Let them think what they want," Max replied, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "I know the truth. This is just the first page of our story, Vivienne. I'm in no rush to skip ahead." Looking up at him, this man who had orchestrated an elaborate ruse just to break through her defenses, Vivienne felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The exhilarating, terrifying sensation of falling. But this time, somehow, she wasn't afraid of where she might land. Later that night, after the last guest had departed and the staff was clearing away the evidence of celebration, Max found Vivienne on the terrace, gazing out at the moonlight dancing across Lake Michigan. "Any regrets?" he asked, coming to stand beside her. She turned to look at him, this man who had upended her carefully ordered world in the span of an evening. "Ask me tomorrow," she said honestly. "Tonight feels too much like a dream to trust my judgment." Max nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Tomorrow, then. I'll pick you up at 7 for dinner. A proper first date." "A proper first date," she agreed. "After an improper non-engagement party." He laughed, then grew serious. "Vivienne, I need you to know something. I've never done anything like this before. I'm not usually impulsive. You planned an entire fake engagement party. That's not impulsive, that's elaborate." "Fair point." His smile was rueful. "What I'm trying to say is that this you matter to me, more than I can properly express." Vivienne felt her carefully constructed walls trembling. "Max, I've been hurt before. Badly. I don't know if I can." "I know about Daniel Reed," he said quietly. She stiffened. "How?" "When I first considered hiring Monarch, I did my research on the company. On you." He held up a hand as she started to protest. "Standard business practice. But what I found made me admire you even more. You took a devastating betrayal and turned it into fuel for building something remarkable." Vivienne looked away, uncomfortable with his knowledge of her past. "That doesn't change the fact that I'm not sure I know how to do this anymore. To trust someone again." "I'm not asking for your trust tonight," Max said gently. "I'm asking for the chance to earn it. Day by day, for as long as it takes." As she met his gaze, Vivienne saw something she hadn't expected. Not just desire or infatuation, but patience. The willingness to wait, to move at her pace, to understand that her heart had been broken before and might need time to heal completely. 7 o'clock tomorrow," she said finally. "Don't be late." His smile was worth every moment of confusion and heartache that had preceded it. "I wouldn't dream of it." 6 months later, Vivienne stood in her office, staring at a different invitation, this one for the annual Harrington Foundation Gala. The event would mark her and Max's first public appearance since the truth about their relationship had become clear to Chicago society. The elegant cardstock felt different in her hands this time. No longer a source of pain, but a symbol of how much had changed. The months since that extraordinary night at the Lakeside Pavilion had been a revelation. True to his word, Max had picked her up the next evening for their first official date. A private dinner on his rooftop terrace overlooking the city. No grand gestures, no audience. Just two people getting to know each other beyond the professional boundaries that had defined their relationship for so long. "I want to hear everything," he'd said that night, pouring her a glass of wine as the city lights twinkled below them. Not the polished, professional Vivienne Montgomery that everyone sees, but the real you. The real me. She'd smiled, swirling the wine in her glass. "She's not that different from the professional version." "I don't believe that for a second." His eyes had held hers, warm and intent. "I've seen glimpses of her. When you argue passionately about lighting design, when you laugh unexpectedly at something I say, When you think no one's watching and you dance a little to the music while checking table arrangements. Vivienne had felt her cheeks warm. You noticed that? I notice everything about you, Vivienne. I have from the beginning. That night had been the first of many conversations that gradually peeled back the layers of protection she'd built around herself. Max had been patient, never pushing, always giving her the space to retreat when her instincts screamed at her to protect herself. Their first kiss, 3 weeks after the non-engagement party, had happened on the shore of Lake Michigan during an early morning walk. No grand romantic gesture, just a natural culmination of growing feelings as the sun rose over the water. It had left her breathless and wondering why she'd waited so long. You're thinking awfully hard about something. Tessa's voice broke into her memories. Her assistant stood in the doorway, eyebrows raised. That invitation isn't going to answer itself, you know? Vivienne smiled, just reflecting on how much can change in 6 months. Speaking of change, Mr. Harrington is here to see you. Again. Tessa's tone was teasing. Max's frequent visits to Monarch's offices had become something of a running joke among her staff. Send him in. Max entered, handsome in a casual sweater and slacks, carrying a small gift bag. I thought you might need a break, he said, kissing her cheek. You've been planning this gala for weeks. Some of us don't have billions to fall back on if our businesses fail, she teased, accepting the bag. Inside was a beautiful leather-bound journal. What's this for? Open it, he suggested, perching on the edge of her desk. Vivienne flipped through the pages, finding them filled with Max's neat handwriting. Each entry was dated, starting 6 months ago. It's everything, Max said quietly. Every thought, every feeling, every moment when I realized I was falling in love with you. I started writing it the day after we met. Vivienne's throat tightened as she read a random entry. Today she argued with me about the lighting for the Peterson event. Her eyes flash when she's passionate about something. I found myself deliberately taking the opposite position just to watch that fire. Another entry, dated 3 months ago, had dinner with Vivienne and her sister tonight. Audrey watched me like a hawk the entire time, clearly ready to destroy me if I hurt her sister. I respect that kind of loyalty. By dessert, I think I'd won her over. Vivienne relaxed when she saw us laughing together. Her smile when she's truly happy could power the entire city. Max? She began, not knowing how to express what she was feeling. I want you to have this before the gala, he said, taking her hand. Because I want you to understand something. Long before that night at the pavilion, long before I had any right to hope, I knew you were extraordinary. The first time Vivienne had brought Max to Sunday dinner at Audrey's apartment, she'd been a bundle of nerves. Her sister was her only family in Chicago, and her opinion mattered more than Vivienne would ever admit aloud. Be nice, she'd whispered to Audrey when they arrived, Max hanging back to take a call in the hallway. I'm always nice, Audrey had replied with a mischievous glint in her eye. But if he thinks throwing a fake engagement party means he gets a free pass from the sister interrogation, he's sorely mistaken. To Vivienne's surprise, Max had handled Audrey's protective questioning with grace and honesty. By the end of the evening, they were swapping stories about Vivienne's most particular clients while she pretended to be offended. He passed, Audrey had declared later, after Max left to bring the car around. I wasn't aware there was a test, Vivienne had replied dryly. There's always a test. Audrey's expression had grown serious. But more importantly, he looks at you like you're magic, Viv. And he's smart enough to know how lucky he is. Those words had stayed with Vivienne, a counterbalance to the doubts that sometimes crept in during quiet moments. Was she moving too fast? Could she really trust this feeling? Was she setting herself up for another heartbreak? But Max had been steady, consistent in a way Daniel never was. When he said he would call, he called. When he made a promise, he kept it. When she needed space, he gave it without making her feel guilty. Small things, perhaps, but to Vivienne they were everything. The journal was your idea, wasn't it? Vivienne asked Audrey a week later as they shopped for dresses for the upcoming gala. Audrey looked up from a rack of evening gowns, surprise evident on her face. How did you know? It seemed like something you would suggest. Vivienne fingered the silk of a deep emerald dress. It was beautiful, AUD. Thank you. Don't thank me. It was all him. I just suggested he find a way to show you he's been serious from the beginning. Audrey pulled out a midnight blue gown with a dramatic back. This one. It's perfect with your coloring. Vivienne took the dress, holding it against herself as she looked in the mirror. I think I'm falling in love with him, she admitted quietly, meeting her sister's eyes in the reflection. I think you fell months ago, Audrey replied gently. You've just been too scared to admit it. Later, trying on the blue dress in the fitting room, Vivienne thought about her sister's words. Had she been in love with Max all along? Was that why the invitation to his supposed engagement party had hurt so deeply? The sapphire ring remained in Max's possession, a promise neither of them was ready to fulfill just yet. But lately, Vivienne had found herself thinking about it more often, wondering how it would feel on her finger. Not yet, she told herself, but maybe someday. The night of the Harrington Foundation Gala arrived with all the anticipation of a debutante ball. Vivienne had outdone herself with the planning, transforming the Chicago Art Institute's Grand Hall into a celestial wonderland, with thousands of tiny lights creating the illusion of stars overhead and tables adorned with arrangements of midnight blue flowers and silver accents. It's breathtaking, Max murmured as they entered together, his hand warm against the small of her back. You've outdone yourself. That's what you pay me for, she replied automatically, then caught herself. Sorry. Old habit. He smiled, understanding in his eyes. Old habits die hard. But for the record, I'm not paying you for this one. Tonight, you're here as my date, not my event planner. The distinction still felt strange sometimes, the blurring of lines between their professional and personal relationships. Monarch Events still handled all Harrington corporate functions, but Vivienne had delegated most of the day-to-day management to her senior team, maintaining oversight while creating necessary boundaries. As they moved through the crowd, Vivienne was acutely aware of the curious glances, the whispered conversations. Chicago society was still fascinated by their unconventional beginning, still speculating about the billionaire and the event planner who had captured his heart. Ignore them, Max said softly, reading her thoughts. They'll find something new to gossip about next week. I don't mind, she replied, surprising herself with the truth of it. Let them talk. We know what's real. What was real was the way Max's eyes found hers across crowded rooms. The late-night conversations about everything and nothing. The quiet Sunday mornings reading the paper together in companionable silence. The respect he showed for her work, her independence, her need to maintain the identity she'd fought so hard to build. What was real was the way he'd held her when she finally told him the full story of Daniel's betrayal. Not just the financial deception, but the emotional manipulation, the way he'd made her doubt her own worth, her own judgment. I will never make you feel that way, Max had promised, his voice fierce with conviction. Never. And he hadn't. Instead, he'd shown her, day by day, that love didn't have to mean losing yourself. That vulnerability didn't have to lead to pain. That trust, given to the right person, could be a source of strength rather than weakness. After the gala, they walked along the lakefront, Vivienne's heels dangling from her fingers, the cool grass beneath her bare feet a relief after hours of standing. Successful evening? Max asked, his jacket draped over her shoulders to ward off the night chill. Very. The foundation raised almost twice what it did last year. That's not what I meant. She glanced up at him, understanding his real question. Yes, it was successful. I didn't feel like your event planner tonight. I felt like your partner. The word hung between them, weighted with meaning. Partner. Not quite fiancé, not merely girlfriend, but something solid and equal and real. Max stopped walking, turning to face her. The moonlight silvered his features, highlighting the intensity in his eyes. Vivienne, there's something I need to ask you. Her heart stuttered. Max. Not that, he said quickly, a smile tugging at his lips. Not yet, though I still have the ring. Then what? The Harrington Foundation is expanding its education initiative, creating technology centers in underserved communities across the country. We need someone to oversee the design of these spaces, someone with vision, with an understanding of how environment shapes experience. He took her hands in his. I want you to consider taking on the project. Vivienne blinked, surprised by the unexpected turn. You want to hire Monarch? No, he said firmly. I want to hire you specifically as a consultant. This would be separate from Monarch's regular work with Harrington Enterprises. This would be yours. Why me? There are architectural firms, educational consultants. Because no one sees spaces the way you do, Vivienne. You don't just create beautiful environments. You create experiences that transform people. That's exactly what these centers need to be. Transformative spaces where kids can imagine different futures for themselves. The passion in his voice was compelling, but Vivienne hesitated. Would this create complications? Us working together directly again? Possibly, he acknowledged, but I think we've proven we can navigate complicated. And this project matters to me, to the foundation, to the communities it will serve. Vivienne thought about it, about the potential challenges and rewards. I'd want complete creative control, she said finally. No interference, even from you. His smile was immediate. I wouldn't have it any other way. As they resumed walking, hands intertwined, Vivienne felt a sense of rightness settle over her. This was what had been missing with Daniel, this feeling of being valued not just for how she made him feel, but for her mind, her vision, her unique perspective on the world. The ring is still waiting, Max said softly after a comfortable silence. Whenever you're ready. No elaborate parties this time, I promise. Vivienne looked at him. This man who had orchestrated an engagement party for an engagement that didn't exist, just to break through the walls around her heart. The man who had then spent 6 months proving that her trust wasn't misplaced. Ask me, she said suddenly, surprising herself. Max's eyes widened. Vivienne, are you sure? I meant what I said about not rushing. I've spent 3 years protecting myself from being hurt again, she interrupted. And then you came along with your ridiculous engagement party scheme and made me realize something. Being safe isn't the same as being happy. Max stopped walking again, taking both her hands in his. So what are you saying? I'm saying I love you, Maxwell Harrington. I love your brilliant mind, your generous heart, and your ridiculous grand gestures. I love that you see me, really see me, and value what you see. And I'm saying that I'm ready to stop being afraid of what might go wrong and start embracing what's already so right. The joy that spread across Max's face was like sunrise breaking over the lake. Without a word, he reached into his pocket and withdrew the velvet box he'd apparently been carrying all evening. Perhaps longer. I had a whole speech prepared, he said, his voice rough with emotion, about how you've changed my life, how you've shown me that success means nothing without someone to share it with, how I want to spend the rest of my days, making you as happy as you've made me. I like that speech, Vivienne said softly. You should definitely give it. Max laughed, then grew serious as he opened the box, revealing the sapphire ring that had started their journey. Vivienne Montgomery, you walked into my life and rearranged everything. My priorities, my expectations, my understanding of what matters. Will you marry me? Not because I orchestrated some elaborate scheme, but because we've built something real and true together. Vivienne looked at the ring, at the man holding it, at the future opening before her. A future she'd stopped believing was possible after Daniel's betrayal. A future filled with love and respect and partnership. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I will. As Max slipped the ring onto her finger. A perfect fit, of course. Vivienne felt the last of her protective walls dissolve. Not because she no longer needed strength, but because she'd found a different kind of strength. The courage to be vulnerable, to trust, to love without reservation. So, Max said, his forehead resting against hers after a kiss that sealed their promise. Should we plan another engagement party? One where you're not the last to know you're the bride-to-be. Vivienne laughed, joy bubbling up from a place that had been closed off for too long. Absolutely not. But I do know an excellent event planner who could help with the wedding. Is she any good? Max teased. The best in Chicago, Vivienne replied. her eyes shining with happiness. But I warn you, she doesn't come cheap. Some things, Max said, drawing her close again, are worth every penny. As they stood together under the vast Chicago sky, the sapphire on Vivienne's finger catching the moonlight like a promise made visible, she understood something she'd forgotten in the aftermath of Daniel's betrayal. Sometimes the greatest risk isn't opening your heart, it's keeping it closed. Sometimes the bravest choice isn't walking away from potential pain, but walking toward potential joy. And sometimes, just sometimes, the most unexpected invitation leads to the most beautiful destination of all. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that protecting yourself can sometimes mean missing out on the greatest gift of all, true connection. And remember, Queens, our past heartbreaks don't define us. They prepare us for the love we truly deserve. 18 months later, Vivienne stood in the center of the newly completed Harrington Foundation Technology Center in Chicago's South Side, watching as neighborhood children explored the space for the first time. Their faces lit with wonder as they discovered the interactive learning stations, the cozy reading nooks, the state-of-the-art computers that would open doors to worlds they'd never imagined. "You've created magic here," Max said, coming to stand beside her. His hand found hers, fingers automatically seeking the sapphire ring that now had a companion wedding band. "We created magic," she corrected him. "Your vision, my design." The center was the first of 12 planned across the country, each one tailored to its community's specific needs while maintaining the core philosophy Vivienne had developed. Spaces that nurtured creativity, fostered connection, and made technology accessible to all. Mrs. Harrington, a small girl, no more than 7, tugged at Vivienne's sleeve. "Did you really make all this?" Vivienne knelt to the child's level. "I helped design it, but it belongs to you and your community now. It's the prettiest place I've ever seen," the girl declared solemnly. "I'm gonna come here every day and learn everything." As the child skipped away to join her friends, Vivienne felt a familiar warmth spread through her chest. This was why she'd agreed to take on the project. Not just for Max, but for moments like this, when she could see the direct impact of her work on people's lives. "You're glowing," Max observed, his arms slipping around her waist. "It's just nice to see it all come together," she replied, leaning into him slightly. "From concept to reality. Rather like us," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. Vivienne smiled, thinking of their journey. From that first meeting in her office to this moment, standing together in a space that represented both their professional collaboration and their personal commitment to creating something meaningful in the world. Their wedding 6 months ago had been intimate and elegant, held at the lakeside boathouse that had been the site of one of their early planning meetings. Audrey had been her maid of honor, radiant in the midnight blue dress they'd found shopping together. The blue orchids that had become their signature had adorned every table, a reminder of beginnings and promises kept. "I have something to tell you," Vivienne said, turning to face her husband. "I was going to wait until tonight, but seeing you here with these kids..." Max's eyes searched hers, curiosity and concern mingling. "What is it?" Vivienne took a deep breath, her hand instinctively moving to rest on her still flat stomach. "We're going to need to design a nursery soon. I'm pregnant." For a moment, Max simply stared at her, shock giving way to joy so pure it transformed his face. "A baby? We're having a baby?" She nodded, tears of happiness threatening to spill. "Due in November. I found out yesterday." Max pulled her into his arms, mindful of the children still exploring around them, but unable to contain his emotion. "Vivienne," he whispered against her hair, "you continue to plan the most extraordinary events." She laughed through her tears, remembering how their story had begun, with an invitation that had broken her heart and then remade it entirely. "This one might be my masterpiece." "Our masterpiece," he corrected gently, echoing her earlier words. As they stood together in the center they'd created, surrounded by the future they were helping to shape, Vivienne thought about the journey that had brought them here. From the professional woman who had guarded her heart so carefully to the wife and soon-to-be mother, who had learned that true strength wasn't found in walls, but in bridges, connections built on trust, respect, and love. Daniel's betrayal had nearly convinced her that vulnerability was weakness, that independence meant isolation. Max had shown her a different truth, that the greatest achievements, the deepest joys, came from sharing yourself fully with someone worthy of that gift. "What are you thinking about?" Max asked, noticing her contemplative expression. "About invitations," she replied with a small smile, "and how sometimes the most unexpected ones lead to the most beautiful destinations." Max's eyes crinkled at the corners, understanding immediately. "I still maintain that planning our engagement party without telling you it was ours was my most brilliant idea ever. It was outrageous and presumptuous," Vivienne countered, the familiar teasing comfortable between them. "And yet, here we are." His hand covered hers where it rested on her stomach, a gesture of protection and promise for their growing family. "Here we are," she agreed softly. Later that evening, as they walked hand in hand along the lakefront that had become their special place, Vivienne reflected on the woman she had been 3 years ago, wounded, guarded, determined never to risk her heart again. How could she have known that the very thing she feared most, opening herself to potential pain, would lead to such profound joy? "Do you ever think about how differently things might have turned out?" she asked Max as they paused to watch the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. "If you hadn't been so persistent, if I hadn't said yes that night?" "Sometimes," he admitted. "But then I remember something my grandmother used to say, the heart knows its home long before the mind accepts the address." Vivienne laughed. "That's surprisingly poetic for a ruthless business tycoon." "I contain multitudes," Max replied with mock seriousness, then grew thoughtful. "But she was right. I think on some level, from that first meeting in your office, we both knew. We just needed time to trust what we knew." As the last rays of sunlight gilded the water, Vivienne thought about the invitation that had started it all. The elegant cardstock, the silver embossing, the words that had seemed to shatter her world, but had actually been the beginning of something beautiful. "I kept it, you know," she said suddenly. "Kept what?" "The invitation. To our non-engagement party. I have it in my keepsake box." Max's expression softened. "Sentimental, Mrs. Harrington?" "Practical," she corrected with a smile. "It's a reminder that sometimes what looks like an ending is actually a beginning. That sometimes the thing that breaks your heart is the very thing that heals it." As they turned toward home, the penthouse overlooking the lake that they'd made their own, Vivienne felt a sense of completion, of rightness. Not because their story was over, but because it continued to unfold in ways more beautiful than she could have imagined. The woman who had once built walls to protect herself had learned that the truest protection came from choosing wisely whom to let in. The event planner who had orchestrated perfect moments for others had discovered that life's most meaningful events couldn't be planned. They could only be embraced, with courage and an open heart. And the invitation that had once seemed like a cruel joke had become the first page of the most important story of her life. A story of second chances, of risks rewarded, of love that arrived unexpectedly but right on time. As Max's hand found hers, the sapphire on her finger catching the last light of day, Vivienne knew with absolute certainty that some invitations, even the most surprising ones, were simply too important to decline. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that protecting yourself can sometimes mean missing out on the greatest gift of all, true connection. And remember, Queens, our past heartbreaks don't define us. They prepare us for the love we truly deserve. Subscribe to Timeless Love Tales with Mr. Harrison for more stories that remind us it's never too late to open our hearts to the possibilities that await when we're brave enough to say yes to love.